It is February 1924. The air is so thin that every breath feels like swallowing knives. At this altitude, over 14,000 feet, your head pounds with every heartbeat. Your lungs burn, your lips crack and bleed. A pilgrim shuffles along a frozen Tibetan path. Her face is darkened with soot and charcoal, weathered by months of exposure to brutal sun and wind. Her hair hangs in greasy, matted strands, deliberately tangled and unwashed. Her clothes are filthy rags, layers of torn fabric held together with cord and desperation. On her feet, cloth wrappings that barely count as shoes. In her hand, a wooden staff and prayer beads. She looks 70 years old. She looks like she's been begging for years. She looks like she's dying. She is none of these things. Beneath the dirt and the disguise and the carefully constructed performance of poverty is a 55-year-old French woman, a woman who speaks 8 languages, a woman who has studied with some of the greatest Buddhist masters alive, a woman who once sang opera in Paris, and she is carrying a secret that could get her executed. She is walking into Lhasa, the forbidden city, the spiritual heart of Tibet, a place where no Western woman has ever been officially allowed to set foot, where foreigners are banned by law, where the punishment for unauthorized entry can be imprisonment, deportation, or worse. If anyone discovers who she really is, if her accent slips, if someone looks too closely at her eyes, if a single person from her past recognizes her, the journey ends. Maybe her life ends too. But here's what makes this story truly strange, what makes it different from every other tale of adventure and exploration you've ever heard. She's not a spy sent by a government. She's not running from the law or from a broken life. This is her story. And this journey, it was never supposed to happen. She's not trying to plant a flag or claim territory or prove something to the world. She's doing this for one reason and one reason only. Because she was told she couldn't, because there were rules and borders and expectations about what a woman, especially a woman her age, was supposed to do and be and want. And Alexandra David-Néel had spent her entire life refusing those rules. This is her story, and this journey, it was never supposed to happen. Welcome to Lines Across Asia. I'm John, and this is episode 2. Last time we talked about Ella Millard, a woman who traveled across continents in the 1930s. Today we go further back in time and deeper into the mountains to meet a woman who made Ella look cautious by comparison. Alexandra David-Néel was born Louise Eugenie Alexandrine Marie David in Paris on October 24, 1868. The world she was born into had very specific, very rigid ideas about what women should be: quiet, obedient, decorative, domestic. Alexandra was absolutely none of these things. From her earliest childhood, she was what people politely called difficult, and what we might now recognize as fiercely, uncompromisingly independent. As a toddler, she would escape her nanny and wander the streets, alone. At 5 years old, she tried to run away to a forest she'd seen in the distance from her window. She didn't make it far, but the impulse was there. The need to go beyond the boundaries she was given. By the time she was a teenager, she was running away regularly. Not to friends' houses or to romantic adventures, but toward borders, toward elsewhere. At 15, she made it all the way to England alone before. Her frantic parents tracked her down and dragged her back home. But you can't really drag someone back when they've already left in their mind. Alexandra studied philosophy at the Sorbonne. She learned Sanskrit, the ancient language of Hindu and Buddhist texts. She devoured books on comparative religion, theosophy, and Eastern mysticism. She questioned everything about Christianity, about Western society, about the roles she was expected to play. Her parents were horrified. She didn't care. She became an opera singer not because she loved the stage, but because it was one of the few ways a woman could earn enough money to travel. And travel she did. She performed across Europe, North Africa, and Asia, and everywhere she went, she was looking, searching, not for sights to see, but for something deeper, something true. In 1904, at the age of 36, she did something shocking. She got married. His name was Philippe Neil A., railroad engineer. A practical, stable, kind man who loved her desperately. And on their wedding day or shortly after, she told him something that would define their entire relationship. I will leave, often, for months or years at a time, and you will wait. And here's the most remarkable part, he agreed. For the next 40 years, Philippe would send her money, support her travels, and wait patiently in France while his wife disappeared into Asia for years at a time. They wrote letters, hundreds of them. Tender, honest, sometimes painful letters. But they rarely lived together. It sounds cruel. Maybe it was. But Alexandra never pretended to be something she wasn't. She never promised a conventional marriage. And Philippe loved her enough to let her go. By 1911, Alexandra was in India, supposedly for a short research trip. That trip would last 14 years. She studied with Buddhist masters in Sikkim. She learned Tibetan. She meditated in caves. She met lamas and monks and began practicing Buddhism not as an outsider but as a sincere student. And in 1914 she met someone who would change everything. His name was Afra Yang Den. He was a young Tibetan monk, 15 years old when they met. She became his teacher in Western knowledge. He became her teacher in Tibetan language, customs, and spirituality. They traveled together, studied together, and eventually Alexandra legally adopted him as her son. Together, they would attempt the impossible. But first, you need to understand what made Lhasa so forbidden, and why that made it irresistible. Lhasa wasn't just remote. It wasn't just difficult to reach. It was deliberately, politically, spiritually closed. Let me paint the picture. In the early 1900s, Tibet was one of the most isolated places on Earth. The Dalai Lama's government had spent centuries carefully controlling who entered and who didn't. And their policy on foreigners, especially Western foreigners, was simple. No entry, no exceptions. This wasn't paranoia. The British had invaded Tibet in 1904, forcing their way to Lhasa with military force, killing thousands of Tibetan soldiers armed with antique muskets and swords. The trauma of that invasion made Tibet even more determined to keep outsiders away. Oh, by the 1920s, when Alexandra was planning her journey, Tibet had checkpoints, border guards, officials, who demanded permits that were nearly impossible to obtain. Any foreigner caught traveling without authorization would be arrested and deported immediately. And it wasn't just political. For Tibetan Buddhists, Lhasa was sacred. The Potala Palace, the home of the Dalai Lama, was the spiritual center of their world. The Jahang Temple held the most precious Buddha statue in Tibet. Pilgrims walked for months, sometimes years, to reach Lhasa and receive blessings. This wasn't a tourist destination. This was the Holy of Holies. For Europeans, though, Lhasa became an obsession, the forbidden city, the last unconquered mystery. Explorers tried to reach it and failed. Spies tried to infiltrate it and were caught. Christian missionaries tried to convert it and were expelled. Almost all of them were men. Almost all of them failed. But here's where Alexandra was different from all those explorers and adventurers. She didn't want to conquer Lhasa. She didn't want to write a triumphant telegram announcing her success to the world. She didn't want to claim it for France or for Christianity or for Western science. She wanted to understand it. She had been studying Tibetan Buddhism for over a decade, reading texts, practicing meditation, learning from masters. But she absolutely knew, that reading about something and living it are completely different things. And Lhasa held the key. The monasteries, the libraries, the living tradition of teachings passed down for centuries. The rituals she'd only read about, the practices she'd only glimpsed from the outside. So in 1923, after years of living near the Tibetan border, after mastering the language and the customs and the religious practices, she made a decision. She would walk to Lhasa in secret, disguised as a Tibetan beggar pilgrim, with no permits, no official permission, no government backing, no rescue plan if things went wrong. Just her, Yangden, and 2,000 miles of some of the most brutal terrain on earth. When she told people her plan, they thought she was insane. A 55-year-old European woman, walking through the Himalayas in winter, pretending to be Tibetan. It was suicide. She probably knew they were right. She went anyway. To understand what Alexandra did, you have to understand what she erased. This wasn't just putting on a costume. This wasn't just dyeing her hair and wearing local clothes. This was a complete transformation, a disappearing act. She darkened her skin with soot, lampblack, and cocoa. She rubbed it into every visible part of her body, face, hands, neck. She let her hair grow long and stopped washing it, letting it tangle into the matted locks of a wandering pilgrim. She wore layers of torn, filthy clothing that she deliberately never cleaned. She practiced walking differently. Tibetan pilgrims have a particular gait shaped by altitude, by terrain, by the rhythm of prayer. She learned it. She practiced a limp to appear older and frailer than she was. She learned to beg in the exact dialect and accent of the region they'd be passing through. She memorized prayers. She studied the gestures, the body language, the social codes of Tibetan beggars and pilgrims. She carried a staff, prayer beads, and a small bag containing nothing that would identify her as European. No documents, no Western objects, nothing. By the time she started walking, she didn't look French. She didn't look European. She didn't even look like Alexandra David-Néel anymore. She looked like nobody. A poor old pilgrim woman, invisible, and that invisibility would save her life. The journey began on a cold day in October 1923. She and Yangden left from a monastery near the China-Tibet border and started walking south toward Lhasa, on foot, in winter, through one of the harshest environments on the planet. They walked through snow that came up to their knees, then their waists, through mountain passes that soared, over 16,000 feet, where the air has half the oxygen of sea level, and every step feels like climbing, stairs with a weight on your chest. They walked through forests where bandits waited, through villages where one wrong word, one slip of accent, one moment of carelessness could expose them. They slept in caves when they could find them, in forests when they couldn't, sometimes in the open air, huddled together against temperatures that dropped far below freezing, and they were hungry, constantly, painfully, desperately hungry. Sometimes they begged for food and were given barley flour or sampa roasted grain mixed with rancid yak, butter tea. Sometimes they were given scraps, sometimes they were turned away. Alexandra wrote later about boiling old leather to make soup, about chewing on bones other people had thrown away, about fantasizing about food the way other people fantasize about love or wealth. Her feet bled, her skin cracked. She lost weight until her bones showed through her skin, but she kept walking. Here's what makes this story so strange, so difficult to fully comprehend. Alexandra wasn't just enduring this journey. She was choosing it. Every single day. She could have stopped at any point. She could have revealed herself to British officials in India who would have escorted her to safety. She could have used her husband's money, waiting in banks, to buy comfort and passage home, but she didn't, because she had already crossed the line inside herself. The kind of line you can't uncross. The kind that separates who you were from who you're becoming. Let me tell you about one moment when it almost ended. They were approaching a checkpoint controlled by Tibetan officials, or maybe they were bandits. The line was often blurry. Men with swords and old rifles who controlled the narrow pass through the mountains. Yongdin did the talking. He explained they were pilgrims heading to Lhasa. Poor, harmless. The men were suspicious. They searched their bags, roughly, looking for anything valuable or anything strange. They asked questions. Where are you from? What monastery? Who is your teacher? Yongdin answered calmly, perfectly. His story was consistent and believable. But then one of the men looked at Alexandra. Really looked. She kept her head down, eyes on the ground, silent, playing the part of a mute or simple-minded old woman. The man stepped closer. He stared at her face, at her hands. She didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't react. In her mind, she was repeating a mantra, over and over, emptying herself of fear, of identity, of everything. After what felt like an eternity, the man stepped back. He waved them through. Alexandra wrote later, I forgot to breathe. I forgot my name. I was no one. That's the cost of this kind of journey. You don't just disguise your body, you erase yourself. And maybe in that erasure, you find out who you really are. Now let's talk about the part of this story that makes some people uncomfortable, the part that gets dismissed, or rationalized, or debated. Alexandra David-Néel didn't just observe Tibetan Buddhism from a distance. She didn't just study it academically. She practiced it deeply, seriously, for years. She meditated for hours, sometimes entire days, in freezing caves at high altitude. She studied with accomplished lamas who taught her advanced techniques that are usually reserved for lifelong monastics. She learned Tamo, a meditation practice that supposedly generates inner heat through breath control and visualization. And yes, she claimed it worked. She described seeing monks practicing Tamo, sitting in frozen lakes, steam rising from their bodies. Was it real? Was it exaggeration? Was it extreme physiological discipline that we simply don't have the language to describe properly? I'm not here to tell you what to believe. But here's what matters. Alexandra believed it. And whether it was mysticism or biology or the power of absolute mental focus, it kept her alive. On those nights when she and Yongdin had no shelter, when temperatures dropped so low that stopping meant death, she used Tamo. She controlled her breathing. She visualized fire in her belly. She generated heat, and she survived. She also claimed to have witnessed other phenomena during her years in Tibet: telekinesis, telepathy, monks who could walk for days without food or water, covering impossible distances in trance states. She wrote about these experiences matter-of-factly, without trying to convince skeptics. She simply reported what she saw and experienced. And here's what I find most interesting about Alexandra's approach to all of this. She never argued. She never defended herself. She never tried to prove anything to anyone. When critics dismissed her mystical experiences as hallucinations or lies, she shrugged. She lived her experiences and moved on. That's a kind of freedom most people never find. the freedom to not need anyone else's validation, to not care whether you're believed. Alexandra practiced Buddhism not to impress anyone or to gain followers. She practiced it because it gave her something she'd been searching for her entire life. Not certainty, not answers, but a way to sit with the mystery. And then, one day in February 1924, after 4 months of walking, there it was. No dramatic music, no border crossing, no checkpoint where she had to hold her breath. Just a city appearing in the valley below, white buildings climbing the hillside, the massive Potala Palace. Rising above it all, golden roofs gleaming in the thin mountain sunlight. Lhasa. Alexandra David-Néel walked in with a crowd of pilgrims, head down, silent, one anonymous face among hundreds. No one stopped her, no one questioned her. No one knew. She had done it. The thing everyone said was impossible. But here's what's remarkable. She didn't celebrate. She didn't reveal herself. She didn't run to find the nearest telegraph office to announce her triumph to the world. She kept the disguise. For 2 months, she lived in Lhasa as a beggar pilgrim. She rented a tiny room in a poor neighborhood. She visited the Potala Palace, walking through the halls where the Dalai Lama lived and taught. She attended teachings at the great monasteries. She walked the Barker, the circular pilgrimage route around the Jakong temple with thousands of other devotees spinning prayer wheels, prostrating, praying. She saw ceremonies that outsiders had never witnessed. She listened to debates among monks. She observed the daily rhythm of a city that had existed in isolation for centuries. And all the while, she was invisible, just another poor woman seeking blessings. She wrote later that those 2 months were some of the most peaceful of her life. Not because Lhasa was paradise, it wasn't. The city was poor, the living conditions were harsh, and she was still hungry and cold. But because she had finally reached the place she'd been walking toward for years, not just geographically, spiritually, she had proven to herself, which was all that mattered, that the impossible was only impossible until you did it. And then quietly, she left, the same way she came, on foot, in disguise, unnoticed. She and Yangdin walked out of Lhasa, back through the mountains, back toward the border. It wasn't until she reached India, months later, that she finally revealed who she was and what she'd done. And when the news broke, when newspapers around the world reported that a 55-year-old French woman had walked into forbidden Lhasa and lived there undetected for 2 months, the world was stunned. Some people celebrated her as a hero, the first Western woman to reach Lhasa, an explorer, a trailblazer. Some people accused her of lying, of exaggerating, of making the whole thing up. Alexandra didn't care about either reaction. She had already moved on. Alexandra David-Néel lived to be 101 years old. She never softened, never apologized, never stopped traveling or studying or questioning. In her 90s, she was still renewing her passport, just in case. Still planning trips she might not be healthy enough to take. Still refusing to settle into the quiet retirement everyone expected. She wrote over 30 books. She gave lectures. She continued practicing Buddhism until her death in 1969. But here's what I want you to take from this story, what I want you to remember when the details fade. This isn't really about Tibet. It's not even about Buddhism, though that was her path. This is about refusal. The refusal to accept the life other people design for you. The refusal to let borders, geographical, social, spiritual, invisible, define what's possible. The refusal to stop searching just because the search is difficult or dangerous or makes no sense to anyone else. Alexandra David-Néel wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. She wasn't kind or selfless or morally perfect. She was selfish in many ways. She abandoned her husband for years at a time. She put Yongdin in danger. She broke laws. She was stubborn and difficult and impossible. But she lived fully, completely, on her own terms. And in a world that constantly tells us who we should be, what we should want, where we should stay, how we should behave, that kind of refusal is rare. That kind of freedom is precious. So here's my question for you, listening to this right now. What's your Lhasa? What's the thing you're not supposed to do? The place you're not supposed to go? The person you're not supposed to become? What rule have you been following without questioning it? What border have you accepted as real? And what would it really cost to walk toward it anyway? I don't know your answer. Maybe you don't either yet. But Alexandra's story tells us this. The cost of going is high. Hunger, cold, danger, loneliness, misunderstanding. But the cost of not going might be higher. The cost of living a life designed by other people's fears and expectations. The cost of never knowing what you were capable of. The cost of safety. Alexandra David-Néel disappeared into the mountains of Tibet, but she found herself there. Maybe that's the real journey. Not the miles walked, but the self discovered. This was Lines Across Asia, Episode 2. The woman who was not supposed to be there. Thank you for listening. Until then, keep walking toward your Lhasa.